In this lecture, we're gonna go back to the this keyword and learn how we can set the this keyword manually, and also why we would want to do that. So let's say we are an airline again, and in this case, Lufthansa, which is the biggest European airline group, by the way. And so let's create a very simple object for this airline with a very simple booking method as well. So we have the airline name, we have the code, basically. We also want to keep an array of bookings, so also inside of the object, and then the book method. And remember from the previous section, I will now start using the way of writing methods using the enhanced object literal syntax. And so that's simply by defining the method like this without having to write function. So remember, before this, we used to do this, right? And if you still prefer this syntax, you can still do this one, but I do actually prefer the new syntax. And so I will just start using this one now. So the flight number and also the passenger name here. So then let's log something to the console. And again, this could have been boilerplate code here, but it's also good to practice writing this. So this should be a template string, booked a seat on. So basically we want to print like Jonas booked a seat on Lufthansa flight and then the flight number. And so here we are now going to get the airline name from the object. And so we already learned that for that we use the this keyword, right? And then flight this dot IATA code. So that's going to be the LH and then the flight number itself that we pass into the function. So the flight number. So for now, this is just a nice review of how the this keyword works, right? And of course, I will now assume that you know how all of this works, because otherwise I will have to explain the same things over and over again. And so, as I mentioned before, you should only progress once you really understand a certain topic. Anyway, let's now use the book function here. And I will use the flight number 239 and then with my own name. And let's right away book another Lufthansa flight for, let's say, Mike Smith on flight number 635. John Smith. And now if we take a look at the results, then indeed, everything works just as expected, right? And so it's important to understand that the this keyword here points to the Lufthansa object itself, because that's the object on which the book method here was called. So again, that's just what I explained before, right? But now let's say that after some years, the Lufthansa group created a new airline. So let's create Eurowings here. And then a very similar object. So with the airline, the code, and also an empty bookings array. Okay. Oh, and by the way, we actually also want our book method here to add a new object to our bookings here. So that's super important as well. So I forgot that. So let's go back here. So we will say again this, and then the bookings array. And then let's push a new object in there with the flight. And so that's essentially going to be this one. So the code plus the flight number. And then also the passenger name. And then let's quickly log that to the console here. So this.bookings is not a function, and of course it's not. We need the push method indeed. And so now you see that we have an array of our two bookings here. So that works perfectly. But now, anyway, going back here to Eurowings, of course, we also want to be able to take bookings for a Eurowings flight. So as being this airline, right? Now, taking this exact same method here and simply copying it and pasting it here is a bad practice, right? So, of course, we are not going to do that. So instead, we will just take the method and store it in an external function. And then we can reuse that function for all of the different airlines. So what I mean is to create a new function called book, and we will simply set it to Lufthansa.book. All right. So again, this is possible because JavaScript has first-class functions. And so we can simply take this function value here. So that's this function, and then store it into a new variable, which is then going to be also the book function. Okay. Now we could have written the function here also literally, but that's just not necessary. We have it right here. And so let's just leave it there and assign it to book right here. Okay. So let's try to use this book function to do a new booking now. But what do you think is going to happen? So 23, and then let's say Sarah Williams. And let's give it a save. And now we get cannot read property airline of undefined. So do you know why this happened? Well, it's because this function here, the book function, is now just a regular function call. And so as we learned in one of the previous sections, in a regular function call, the this keyword points to undefined, at least in strict mode. All right. So once more, this book function is no longer this method. Okay, it's just not. It is now this separate function here. It's a copy of this one, but it's not a method anymore. It's now a function. And so here it's a regular function call. And so therefore, the this keyword inside of it will now point to undefined. And that's why I kept telling you earlier that the this keyword depends on how the function is actually called. Okay, so make sure to understand this dynamics here. But now, how do we actually fix this problem? So, in other words, how do we tell JavaScript that we want to create a booking on the new Eurowings airline? Or even, how do we tell it that we want to book on Lufthansa here? Well, basically, we need to tell JavaScript explicitly what the this keyword here should be like. So if we want to book a Lufthansa flight, the this keyword should point to Lufthansa. But if we want to book a Eurowings flight, then the this keyword should point to Eurowings. So how do we do that? How do we tell JavaScript explicitly or manually what the this keyword should look like? Well, there are three function methods to do that, and they are call, apply, and bind. So when we first talked about the this keyword, I think I mentioned these methods back then, and so now we're going to use them, at least the call and apply methods. Okay, so let me show you how. So instead of just doing this, which doesn't work, let's actually comment that out. Does not work. So instead, we use book dot call. All right. And remember that a function is really just an object, and objects have methods, and therefore functions can have methods too. And the call method is one of them. And in the call method, the first argument is exactly what we want the this keyword to point to. So let's say we want an Eurowings flight. And then, as usual, the rest of the arguments. So 23 and Sarah Williams. All right. And then let's log to the console also the Eurowings object. Let's run this, and then I will explain a bit better what just happened. But indeed, we now have the bookings array, and in there we have the object with the EW23, and so EW comes from here, so exactly from the Eurowings object, and then also, of course, the name. And again, it is inside the bookings array of the Eurowings object. So let's recap what happened here. So this time we did actually not call the book function ourselves. Instead, we called the call method, and it's then this call method which will call the book function with the this keyword set to Eurowings. So whatever we pass as the first argument of the call method. And so this allows us to manually and explicitly set the this keyword of any function that we want to call. Then all the arguments after the first one are simply the arguments of the original function. And so in the case of the book function, of course, that's the flight number and the passenger name. And of course now we can do the same also for Lufthansa. So book.call, this time with Lufthansa, and let's book someone else on flight 239. Let's say Mary Cooper, and let's log again the Lufthansa object, and let's do it now here. And indeed, this string that we get here is completely correct, and in here, so in the Lufthansa bookings array, we now have, of course, 3 bookings. Okay? And so that, of course, happened because this time we set the this keyword inside of the function call to Lufthansa. And so now this here is again back to pointing to Lufthansa, while before, right here, it was being pointed to Eurowings. All right? So even though the code of this function is inside of the Lufthansa object, we made it so that the this keyword in here pointed to Eurowings. So to this object, this new one right here. Okay, so we have a way now of manually manipulating the this keyword using the call method. And of course, we could now keep going and create more airlines into the Lufthansa group, like the Swiss Airlines, Now, of course, these property names, they all need to have the exact same format as this original object here, because this method is trying to read just these properties. So it's always IATA code and bookings, as you see here, and airline. And so, of course, we need to use exactly these property names here as well. But just like this, we can now go ahead and use our book function on the Swiss airline. And so this time we will set the this keyword in the book call to the Swiss object. 583, and let's book another flight for Mary Cooper here. And indeed it worked again. So here is the booking again. Okay, there's just some weird thing here. And so, oh, actually here it needs to be airline as well. So I was telling you, you need to use the same property names, and I wasn't even doing it myself. So it needs to be airline just like it is here, and the same here too. And now the string is, of course, correct here. Okay, so let me add a comment here. Call method, because in fact there is a similar method to the call method, which is called the apply method. And the apply method does basically exactly the same thing. The only difference is that apply does not receive a list of arguments after the this keyword. So it doesn't receive this list here, but instead it's going to take an array of the arguments. Okay, and so it will then take the elements from that array and pass it into the function. So let's say flight data. So I'm just going to create quickly an array here with the flight number and the passenger name. So book on the same flight, George Cooper. And now we can use apply on the book function. So apply, And then just as here in the call method, the first argument is the this keyword. But now the second argument, it needs to be, as I just said, an array of data. So let's pass in the flight data array here. And then let's just take a look. Well, let's just take this one here actually. And so, indeed here it worked again. All right. This apply method is not that used anymore in modern JavaScript, because now we actually have a better way of doing the exact same thing. And do you know what I'm talking about? So let me show it to you. Book.call. So instead of using apply, we can still use call, again with Swiss, and then we can simply use the spread operator to take the data out of flight data and basically put them here. So this here is the same as this one. And so right now with modern JavaScript, I prefer to just always use the call method and then spread out the arguments from an array like this. So again, this here is exactly the same as this. So in summary, we now have yet another tool in our toolbox here. And this one is one that allows us to explicitly define the this keyword in any function that we want. But there is actually yet another method which allows us to do the same thing. And that's the bind method. It's more important actually than the call and apply methods, so I'm going to leave it for the next lecture.